Well, hello again, greetings and salutations to you. This week we are going to be looking at chapter 10. So, last chapter we looked at was really focused on inequality in the United States. So, inequality that we're pretty familiar with within our own country. But this week we're going to take a much broader perspective when it comes to inequality and look at global inequality or global stratification. So a couple definitions first. Global inequality refers to the concentration of resources, whether that be natural resources or money, in certain nations, and that concentration in certain nations significantly affects the opportunities of individuals in poorer and less powerful countries. And last week when we talked about the US, we talked about the top 1% and the top 0.01%, having more wealth than a vast majority of Americans. Well, we see the same kind of dynamics going on at the global level. So the world's 62 richest people own the same wealth as the poorest 3.6 billion people. Now, global stratification is pretty similar to global inequality, but this refers to the unequal distribution of resources among nations, right? So just a different way of communicating the same idea here. There's kind of two dimensions that are often looked at when we talk about global stratification. The gaps between nations, which is mostly what we're going to focus on this week. But, a lot of scholars that look into this also look at gaps within nations. That's mostly what we looked at, last week when we talked about inequalities within the United States. So that's important to keep in mind, though, when we're looking at all of these gaps between nations, is that even in some of the poorest countries, there are still, there often are a few elites, elite families who kind of tend to still have quite a bit of wealth or income compared to the rest of the people in their nations. Now, why does this matter, right? Well, the way that wealth, income, resources are distributed across different countries and nations and peoples significantly affects our way of life, right? The quality of life, the standard of living that somebody can expect or achieve. Their everyday, day-to-day survival can be severely impacted by what country we just happen to have been born into. So in the next few slides, we'll look at a few different factors that might be affected by whether someone is born into like a high income country, a low income country, or a middle income country. So just some things to think about as we get started here. First off, population. Where do most of the world's population live? We live in, you see the biggest kind of chunk here, about 4 billion people live in lower middle income countries. And then 1 billion live in low income, 1 billion in upper middle income, and 1 billion in high income countries. So most people in the world, 5 billion people live in low to lower middle income countries. Life expectancy is a big one. You can see here, low income countries, males can expect to live to about age 58, females to age 60. Compare that with high income countries living an extra 2 decades. Just about. Males in a high income country can expect to live to 77, females to 83. Premature deaths under age 5. And this is based on a statistic out of every 1,000 births. So in low-income countries, 120 out of 1,000 babies that are born will die before they get to age 5. Compare that to only 7 in high-income countries. Access to improved sanitation. This is in percent. So about 35% of people in a low-income country have access to, all of the luxuries that we take for granted in high-income countries, like, centralized plumbing, toilets, running water, sanitation and filtration plants, right? Whereas, about 99% of people in high-income countries, we kind of just take it for granted. Deaths caused by infectious disease. 36% of people will be affected by this in a low-income country compared to only 7% in a high-income. Years of education. Average person in a low-income country can expect about 8 years of education, so probably not too much farther, past maybe middle school or early high school years. Whereas in high-income countries, we pretty much expect to at least get a high school degree, if not, even going to college. So we tend to have 14 to 15 years of education. Got another slide for you here. Let's see, literacy rate. Where'd my pen go? There we go. So literacy rate, about 66% of people in a low-income country has access to, printed materials, education, to, learn how to read and write, whereas 98% of people in high-income countries are considered literate. Fertility rate, number of children per woman. So about 4 children for every woman in a low-income country compared to 2 in a high-income country. Rate of natural population increase. So which countries are, expanding the fastest? Well, low-income countries, growing about 2.27% every year, whereas high-income countries are only growing at a rate of about 0.39. Net migration rates. Who's going where? Low-income countries, people are emigrating. They're moving out. They're going away. They're trying to come to the higher-income countries. Whereas in the high-income countries, the opposite side of the coin, people are tending to come in. They're immigrating into those countries. Urban population. About 1 in 4 people in a low-income country lives in a city or an urban environment, which is also usually correlated with more job opportunities and more quality healthcare, access to sanitation, education, all this other stuff we're talking about. Only about 1 in 4. In a high-income country, about 4 out of 5, let's round up. About 4 out of 5 people can expect to live, near an urban environment with better access to, social services, job opportunities. One more slide of these. Think of technology, phone subscriptions, access to cell phones, landlines even, infrastructure that's needed for all of that. Only about 22% of people in a low-income country has access to a cell phone. Compare that to just about everyone in a high-income country. Internet users, about 2.3% of people in low-income countries have reliable access to the internet, whereas it's closer to about 70% of people in high-income countries. Personal computers. you have access to a computer or a laptop. Only about 1.2% of people in a low-income country has access to a computer, about 60.5% in high income. Vehicles, personal cars, about 5.8 out of every 1,000 people have access to a personal vehicle in a low-income country, 435 out of 1,000 in a high-income country. And kind of related to that, carbon emissions, carbon dioxide emissions, pollution, right? So who, out of all of this, which countries are most kind of to blame for a lot of our global pollution levels? Well, as you can see, low-income countries have very little to do with our pollution emissions, whereas high-income and upper middle-income countries kind of bear the brunt of that blame. So that's why global stratification kind of matters. There's a lot of things that maybe we don't even think about, that we take for granted, that are, just kind of repercussions of the fact that we, have been lucky enough to have been born in a high-income country. Now, next we're going to talk about the way we talk about global stratification, the way we label countries, right? So those slides on the last few, the pictures on the last few slides depicted or labeled countries according to like high income, lower middle, higher middle, and low income countries. But there's lots of different ways that we're socialized to talk about global stratification and kind of how we classify different countries. And in sociology, especially if you're a symbolic interactionist, it's very important to kind of think about the ways that we talk about global inequality, the ways that we label different countries. And there have been arguments that sometimes the way we label different countries can have a bit of an ethnocentric or a Eurocentric kind of bias to it, that sometimes maybe implies that poorer nations need to emulate the higher income nations. So for instance, you may have heard the words when we talk about global inequality. You've probably heard, undeveloped countries, developing countries, developed countries, or maybe you've heard, non-industrialized, partly industrialized, industrialized. Or, it's also still common to hear, first world countries, second world, and third world. And each of those terms kind of gets a little bit of flack from the sociological community, because just think about the repercussions of those labels. First world, second world, and third world, kind of carries this implication that, some countries are superior, first place countries, and then some are, kind of in the middle of the road, your second world, your second place countries, and your third world countries, you're losers in the global scheme of things. Or even, these terms, undeveloped, developing, and developed. Well, how would you feel if someone told you that you were undeveloped, right? So there's certain connotations, repercussions of the ways that we, frame and talk about global inequality that might have effects on how we think about global inequality and poorer countries and nations. So we're going to look at some different ways that this terminology has changed over time. Now, back during the Cold War, there was, that's kind of when this way of conveying countries as first world, second world, and third world came into being. So between 1945 and about 1980, that's kind of the way that world was conveyed. And if you were, if you sided with the capitalist the United States, you were a country that was siding with them, you would be kind of conveyed as first world country, or maybe a second world country if you were kind of working on things. And then, the communist countries, those that were siding with the USSR, were often presented or conveyed as third world countries. And this is during an era that was called the era of noblesse oblige, which means first world responsibility. So it was kind of like conveyed during this time that it was kind of the US's responsibility to make sure that countries around the world had assistance, had help to take them away from communism and the USSR, and to assist them in developing capitalist practices and economies, and embracing kind of this more first world way of living and thinking. So global inequality was really defined in this kind of like first, second, third world terminology, where first world countries were places that had really embraced capitalism, like the US, like Japan, like England. Second world countries were kind of the in-between categories. They were kind of moving toward capitalism. They had maybe kind of middle of the road, moderate economies, higher standards of living than many other countries. So places, especially during this era, like China, third world countries were the poorest. They were undeveloped countries, and not a lot of industrialization, tended to not have a developed market economy. If they did have a developed economy, it was usually communist. So a lot of Latin American countries and sub-Saharan African nations. And then over time, there was kind of this fourth category added in there called the fourth world. And this referred to, think of like Native Americans, right? Stigmatized minority groups that weren't really given a full political voice within the territory that they lived in, that were kind of denied a political voice. Now, in the 70s, this sociologist named Emanuel Wallerstein came along, and he presented his theory or his perspective of world systems approach, or world systems theory. And he thought of the global economy not as like a bunch of separate, distinct nations, each with their own history and their own economy, and they all kind of like, were like acting independently of each other. He didn't think that that was the way that the world and the economy worked. He said the global economy was complex. It was interconnected. It was a system in which there was an economic hierarchy of nations, where some nations were in kind of the positions of higher power. They had a lot of resources. And because of that, other nations were left in a subordinate position with few resources, and were more kind of as a result of the other nations being rich. So for a world system sociologist like Wallerstein, he would view that the wealth and progress of the wealthy nations is borne on the backs of poor nations. That in order for nations to be rich, other nations have to be disadvantaged. And he said that there were certain, structural, systemic obstacles that would keep certain countries from mobilization. So in his view, not all countries could not be equal. It was like part of the world system that, the poor nations had to exist in order for rich nations to exist. So he came up with these new terms to apply or categorize countries within this world systems approach: core, semi-periphery, and periphery. So he said the core nations, think of the core of an apple, right? These are your dominant capitalist countries. These are your really rich nations, your highly industrialized, very urbanized, super technological nations. They have a lot of power globally. They can leverage that power to get, advantages in global trade agreements. They're often viewed as, economic powerhouses. They have big GDPs, lots of money on hand to lend and trade out. And they're, these countries, these core nations have a lot of sway when it comes to like global economic legislation that can then have implications for other countries all around the world. So the US would be a prime example, also England or Spain, France, Sweden, Germany, Japan. Those would all be examples of our core nations. And the second label he came up with was the semi-periphery. So the semi-periphery he called, kind of the in-between nations. These are ones that, like Mexico, they're not quite powerful enough to dictate global policies, but they do act as a major source for raw materials, cheap labor. They provide an expanding middle-class marketplace for core nations. So that means, not everyone in the semi-periphery nations is like living in destitute conditions. There's actually a pretty solid middle class, a pretty solid standard of living. So Mexico is a great example. It provides cheap agricultural and factory labor to the U.S., also supplies goods to the U.S. market at a rate that kind of the U.S. can dictate. However, it's kind of classified as semi-periphery because, Mexico doesn't tend to have as strong of like labor protections or constitutional protections that we have in the U.S. And our third category are the peripheral nations, or the periphery nations. And these are countries that are like almost entirely economically dependent on core and semi-periphery nations for jobs and for aid. So a periphery nation has very little industrialization, it's very agrarian, very rural. What they do have in terms of technology is usually kind of like used, outdated, cast-off technologies that like core nations just send to them. They're not using them anymore. They typically have very unstable governments, very corrupt governments, inadequate social programs, not a lot of healthcare or education offered, tend to be exploited by other nations for cheap labor and raw materials. So, look at the tags in your closet right now on your clothes, right? The chances are most of what is in your closet or in your dresser, was made in a peripheral nation, place like Bangladesh or Guatemala. If we knew everything that was in our cell phones, and y'all, I encourage you to look up all the different, raw materials that go into our computers and our cell phones, and where those raw materials come from. The vast majority of them come from these peripheral nations. So that's kind of the world systems way of classifying countries, core, semi-periphery, periphery, and it's all like one interconnected system. Now, the World Bank classifies countries a little bit more bluntly. It's either, According to the World Bank, you're either a high income, a middle income, or a low income country. And that's based on your gross national income. So high income country are countries that have a gross national income of at least $12,747 per person, which, well, think about if you had that income in the United States, you would pretty much be classified as living in poverty, right? So, but this is like the global average for a high income nation is just under $13,000 per person per year. So that just tells you in itself that, in the US, we are even better off than a lot of other high income nations for the fact that that would be classified as essentially a poverty level salary in our country. So high income nations are very urban, up to about 83%. There's a lot of cities, not so much country or rural or agrarian life going on. There's a global organization called the OECD, the Organization for Economic and Cooperative Development. It was created in 1960. It contains 38 of the world's most wealthy nations, and they meet pretty regularly to discuss policies, economic and social policies. And you can see over here on this map kind of the countries that are included in the OECD. Now, not everything is, rainbows and sunshine in high-income countries. There are issues that we confront. Two of the most prominent being capital flight and deindustrialization. So capital flight kind of happens first. It's the movement of capital, like factories, from one nation to another. Usually for cheaper labor, less regulations. So this kind of happened in the US in the late 70s and the 80s and into the 90s. There was a huge movement of capital flight, flying away from the United States into other countries where, maybe the minimum wage wasn't as high, or maybe there weren't as many regulations on, pollution or labor protections, things like that. So companies started to leave the U.S. We saw a lot of factories shutting down across the country, and a lot of those stable factory jobs being lost. Now, the result of capital flight is deindustrialization, which is when, there's not any new companies to come in to replace those jobs that were lost now that all those factories left. So this was a big issue, in the 80s, in the 90s, even into today across our country, where there aren't so many well-paying factory jobs, stable jobs. A lot of those factory jobs, if they have been replaced, they've been replaced with like a lot of service occupations, which don't tend to pay as well. So still an issue that we're kind of grappling with the repercussions of today. So the World Bank's second classification is our middle income nations, and they say that middle income nations fall between about $1,000 to $12,000 per person per year. So nations that fall in that category are middle income nations. Can you imagine if you made $1,000 and $1,006 a year being classified as a middle income nation? Just kind of shows you, when you kind of put things into perspective, how kind of privileged we are to be living in a high income nation. So middle income nations are up to 57% urban. Means a little bit more than half of the people are living in cities, but there's still a pretty large chunk living in, the country, more agrarian, rural areas. Some good examples are Thailand or China. And one big issue that middle-income nations face is something called a structural adjustment program. And usually the result of that is debt accumulation, kind of global debt accumulation. And this happens when countries in kind of this position borrow large sums of money from high-income nations or from the World Bank or the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, in order to fund their expansion or growth goals. But if any of you have ever taken out a big loan, you know most loans come with interest tacked on. And oftentimes, if you don't read the contract very carefully, a lot of interest. So much so that it's almost impossible to pay back the debt. And this happens not just to people, but also to entire countries. So I have, there's a video on Blackboard posted. I believe it's called War by Other Means. It's a John Pilger documentary that really goes into kind of these structural adjustment programs and how they've affected a lot of middle income and low income countries. I believe that one focuses in on the Philippines, which I'm pretty sure they're still paying back their structural adjustment debt from 30 years ago. So that kind of puts a lot of these middle income countries into like this perpetual cycle of debt to high income countries. And then our third classification is low income nations, or low income nations. And these are nations where the average person makes below $1,005 per year. So low-income nations are only about 28% urban, meaning that the majority of people in that country live in very rural areas. They're primarily located in Africa, Southeast Asia today, which, by the way, is where the majority of the world's population lives. And two very critical issues that low-income nations face are absolute poverty and the feminization of poverty. And we'll get more into both of these terms in a minute. But the feminization of poverty refers to the fact that women tend to bear a disproportionate percentage of the burden of poverty. Before we come back to those terms, we're going to look at some theories very fast. We've got a couple theoretical perspectives that sociologists bring to global stratification. Some sociologists abide by kind of the modernization theory perspective, and some prefer the dependency theory perspective. So modernization theory kind of assumes that low-income countries are falling short along lines of industrialization, and they have to improve their global economic standing by, one, changing their society's cultural values, their attitudes toward work and money, and two, moving away from traditional agricultural social organization and moving toward industrialization and other forms of economic growth. So modernization theory kind of assumes that all societies could be equal if only they all kind of industrialized, modernized, and then, inequality could be eliminated. So they kind of, all have to like follow the same steps that, say, the US or England had to follow to get where we are today. If a country started out with step one, the traditional society based on subsistence, farming, fishing, forestry, and mining. And then went to step two, preconditions for takeoff, building infrastructure that's needed before development can take place, like a highway system, like developing a money system, power suppliers, communications. Step three, takeoff, introduction and rapid growth, industrial revolution of manufacturing industries, better infrastructure, financial investment, cultural change. Step 4, drive to maturity. New ideas and technology improve and replace older industries. Economic growth spreads throughout the country. Leading us to step 5, the high mass consumption society. People have wealth, they can buy services and goods. We turn into a consumer society, welfare systems are fully developed, trade expands. And if only every country kind of followed that 5-step process, we can all be equal, all nations. That's the perspective here of a modernization theorist. So, some sociologists, who we'll get to on the next slide, argue that modernization theory is kind of a pipe dream, that, although some industrialized nations are better off than those that are not, modernization theory kind of carries maybe a little bit of an ethnocentric bias. It kind of assumes that every country has to follow the same path as England and the US, has to industrialize and invest in technology and profit and power, and kind of assumes that that should be the primary goal of everyone living across the entire planet. And the critics of modernization theory would say that it kind of ignores the fact that global capitalists may in fact depend on some countries being poorer than others. Kind of a la Immanuel Wallerstein and his world systems theory. Which brings us to the other theory here, dependency theory, which claims on the opposite side of the spectrum that global inequality is primarily caused by wealthier nations exploiting the cheap labor and natural resources of other nations. And this creates a cycle of dependence. Since wealthy nations, like those OECD countries, those 38 nations, choose which countries and which industries to make loans to, they can create highly skewed labor markets that are constructed to benefit the dominant wealthy nations. And it's in the best interest of wealthy nations to ensure the long-term usefulness or dependency of their peripheral partners. They want to see their partners strong enough to provide work and buy consumer goods, but not powerful enough to pose a threat. Now, kind of turn toward poverty for a minute here. So what does poverty mean to you when you have an image in your head of like what poverty looks like? What does it look like? It might be different for all of us, right? Depending on how we grew up. But does it mean, you don't have a microwave or a washing machine or what's that thing called? A garbage disposal, right? Or a refrigerator. Does it mean living paycheck to paycheck? Does it mean being homeless, being chronically malnourished, being afflicted by disease every day of your life? So poverty has a lot of different gradations, right? And depending on how we grew up, we might define it differently. So sociologists kind of define global poverty in 3 main ways, which we'll look at here. Relative poverty is a state of living where people can afford necessities but are unable to meet their society's average standard of living. Have you ever heard that quote, keeping up with the Joneses? What we have is like never enough. There's always some new product coming out that if we can't get it, if we can't afford it, we're poor. For instance, right, I still have an iPhone, I don't know, I think it's an 8 or a 7. I think there's like 12 of them now. How many iPhones are there? But I've certainly known some people, maybe some of you are like this, where if you don't have the newest iPhone, the newest technology, the newest update, it's almost like you feel like you're falling behind, right? So it's kind of like relative poverty. Or say you turn on the TV and the sitcom that you're watching is supposed to portray the average American family, and every adult has a car in that family, and they have a washing and drying machine, and they have a dishwasher and a microwave and a refrigerator and a pool in the backyard, right? But you have a pretty good apartment, you're living okay, but you don't have all those things. Maybe you can't afford a dishwasher or a washer or dryer, and you go to the laundromat. Maybe you can only afford one family car that has to be shared, right? So when you turn on the TV and see this quote unquote average American family, you can feel this sense of like relative poverty. Even though you're living okay, you have a pretty good standard of living, you're not wanting for anything. The image that's presented to us of what we should have, what our lives should look like, can leave us sometimes feeling like we're relatively poor. Now, absolute poverty tends to be, what we see in a lot of these low-income nations. This applies to people who, at the very root of it, they lack basic necessities to live, to survive, like food, like water, like sanitation, like safe housing, like access to healthcare and education. So the World Bank defines absolute poverty as someone who lives on less than $1.90 a day. And this applies to just under about 10% of the global population. Over 700 million people live in this state of absolute poverty around the world. An additional 3 billion people lives very, very close to that limit on less than $2.50 a day. Now, the numbers of people living in absolute poverty, as much as sad as that is, has been getting better since the early 90s. In 1990, about 36% of the global population lived in absolute poverty, which is a pretty drastic number. But by the late 20-aughts, 2015, this percentage has dropped to kind of this record low of 10% now. Today, 9.2%. However, one caveat to this is that while poverty rates have been decreasing around most of the world, China and India, excuse me, there's one big exception to that trend, which is in sub-Saharan Africa, where absolute poverty rates have actually been increasing. Now, our third type of poverty is subjective poverty, which is more kind of like a symbolic interactionist view of poverty. This is a type of poverty where it's like, how do you feel about, your poverty level? How we define ourselves as poor or rich or whatever has to do much more with how a person or a family defines themselves in relation to society. So this gives the individuals themselves a greater say in recognizing whether they feel poor. And this puts kind of a stress on the fact that, sometimes poverty is subjectively experienced. So for instance, a family living out in Nepal, living on a couple dollars a day, might think of themselves as doing well. They might have a little garden in the back. They might have enough food to get by every day. They might be happy and have their children and their family. And they might view their lifestyle as normal. Whereas if, one of us from the US traveled over there, we might, kind of apply our own norms, our own perceptions, right, onto that family and call them poor or be like, oh, woe is me, they're living in absolute poverty. Whereas the family themselves might say, yeah, don't feel bad for us. We're perfectly happy the way things are. So it's subjective poverty, that we can't always just apply our definitions of poverty onto others. That sometimes you need to listen to how people are experiencing their own, situation. Now, I said we'd come back to this term here. So the global feminization of poverty refers again to the fact that there's kind of a gender dimension to poverty in countries across the world, even in the US. Um, Girls and women tend to experience poverty differently than boys and men due to a lot of social and cultural norms and beliefs, as well as institutional barriers. During the 90s, while overall poverty rates were rising in peripheral nations, the rates of impoverishment for women increased nearly 20% more than for men. About 1.5 billion people live in absolute poverty, again, less than $2 a day. 70% of that population is made up of women. And as you can see over here, women own only about 1% of the global property. Women also perform 2/3 of the world's work, produce half of the food that's eaten, but only earn 10% of the world's total income. There's nearly 1 billion adults in the world that are illiterate, and 2/3 of them are women. 1/3 of women are abused or coerced into sex during her lifetime. Now, why is that? I have a few different, explanations. Patriarchal cultural norms, definitely still strong in our country, but even more so, right, around the world and other countries. And that means that girls and women are regularly kind of subjected to a subordinate status in society. Their choices and opportunities are severely restricted, especially compared to boys and men in society. So a lot of girls are even viewed as kind of a burden, that they don't have any productive value apart from their, ability to bear children. And this is why, we'll get into this in a little bit too, child marriages remain very pervasive, particularly across South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. Over 700 million women worldwide today were married before age 18. And when it comes to those child marriages, there's pretty big age gaps. Most girls are married to men who are at least 10 years older than they are. And that, kind of compounds everything. If you're so much younger than your spouse, you already live in a very patriarchal society, that's going to make it especially difficult to exercise any kind of decision making in the marriage, in the household, and it also increases the likelihood of violence and abuse in the relationship. Child marriage really increases the chances that a girl will drop out of school, which will thus have, the repercussions that she'll ever be able to, be employed and have an independent source of income. In a lot of regions around the world, a woman's main method of accessing resources is through a male family member. It's not like in the US where you can go to Wells Fargo as a woman and just open up your own bank account, or apply for a mortgage or a loan, right, or a business loan. You literally cannot do that in a lot of countries as a woman. Women might be expected to receive permission from their husband or their in-laws if they want to leave the house or socialize with others. And even in cases when women are allowed to work and make money, their earnings are often handed over to their husbands or their family members. Also, when it comes to education, in a lot of poorer nations, it's not always a safe or secure learning environment for women. And that can lead a lot of families to, be hesitant to send their daughters to school. There might be dangers like prostitution or sexual abuse at or on the way to school. Girls are often denied education and expelled from school if they become pregnant. There's gender bias in the classroom. Teachers have lower expectations of girls' abilities. There's often also, very few female teachers or role models. And a lot of schools, might be TMI for some of y'all, but a lot of schools lack adequate bathroom facilities. And if you've ever been a girl, around age 12 to 14, when you hit adolescence, girls kind of necessitate some sort of bathroom facility to take care of, their menstruation situation, right? So if a school doesn't have a bathroom where they can take care of, you know, their menstruation, then that might also deter them from wanting to go to school, right? Credit and land ownership. A lot of countries that are poor still grant husbands sole control over marital property and land. Women are unlikely to have bank accounts, savings, or access to credit. And women are often require a male co-signature if they want to take out a loan. They're pretty limited in their ability to inherit land in cases of divorce and widowhood. Even more on this, women in poverty are often responsible for taking care of their families, as well as being responsible for working long, often unpaid hours. Unpaid work might include household work, like working the plot of land of the household, working in the family business, collecting water and firewood, cleaning and cooking. Women in developing countries spend on average 30 hours a week on unpaid work compared to 8 hours a week for men. And obviously, if you're spending that much time on your unpaid work, that doesn't leave a lot of time for paid work and getting an independent income. So women, if they are employed, tend to be employed in really low pay, low skill, part-time positions. Now, kind of touched a little bit on this last week, but feminization of poverty also presents itself in our wealthier nations as well. In the US, women are 20% more likely to suffer from poverty than men. Although only 20% of families have a woman head of households, more than 50% of families of those families live below the poverty line. Elderly women make up the greatest share of the poor who are women, with nearly 7 out of 10 elderly women living in poverty. Minority women are at even greater risk of suffering from poverty. The U.S. has the highest poverty rates of women among industrialized countries. Many women who are in poverty fall into this class, which we talked about last week, the working poor. They work 2 or more jobs and yet still kind of fall into poverty level incomes. And for every $1 a man is able to earn, a woman typically earns about 82 cents. So feminization of poverty, certainly not just an issue we only see in low-income countries. I mentioned a little bit earlier that in the 90s, since the 90s, there's been a drastic reduction in absolute poverty across the globe, with some exceptions, right, which are across sub-Saharan Africa. So even today, most of the poorest countries across the world are located in Africa. There's some exceptions like Egypt or South Africa, but there's a long history of civil wars and corruption and inadequate governance. There's a lack of availability of good arable land due to constant struggles over land ownership, a lack of adequate rainfall, lack of infrastructure for irrigation, not to mention hundreds of years of colonial forces kind of stealing and depleting the land in Africa and the people of Africa, which left very little resources behind, and there's very few opportunities for education and jobs. So, like I said, African income levels have been falling relative to the rest of the world. Africa is actually getting poorer. And the Ebola crisis in 2014 and COVID, in the past few years, has certainly not done anything to reverse that trend. So here you can see this is like a projection of where poverty is going to be by 2030. It was projected out from 2010. So you can see it says up here, by 2030, extreme poverty, absolute poverty, could drop by 2/3, mostly in South and East Asia, yet poverty in sub-Saharan Africa will still largely remain. So you can see the brown graphs over here are 2010 numbers. The green graphs or bars are projections for 2030. And the little zigzag part in the green, in the bars at the bottom, represents the percentage of people living in extreme poverty. You can see, Middle East, North Africa, the little zigzag bars are, barely legible. Same with Europe and Central Asia. Same with Latin America and Caribbean. East Asia and the Pacific, you can see, poverty rates go way down there. South Asia, poverty rates drastically reducing there. And yet, in sub-Saharan Africa, even though there's a little bit of a drop, still the majority of people around the world living in absolute poverty are going to be living in and around sub-Saharan Africa. Now, the thing about poverty is that it tends to be a cycle. And so oftentimes, if you're born into conditions of poverty where there's poor access to food, safe water, healthcare, education, where there's rampant hunger, no sanitation, where there's few work opportunities, rampant disease and malnutrition, premature deaths, depleted and unskilled workforces, high unemployment numbers, low incomes. If you're born into this situation where all of these things are like weighing in on you, the consequences of poverty become the causes of poverty. It's like a self-perpetuating cycle of disadvantage. It's incredibly hard to break out of. So these sociologists, Neckerman and Torch, were really interested in global poverty, and they studied it, and they divided these consequences and causes of poverty into 3 areas. The sedimentation of global inequality, which basically meant once poverty is entrenched in an area, it's almost impossible to overcome it. The effects of physical and mental health. Poverty brings with it malnutrition, high infant mortality rates, emotional stress, relative deprivation, and that has its own self-reinforcing consequences. And poverty brings a high prevalence of crime. Going back to the deviance chapter, right? And Robert Merton's strain theory. If you don't have a legitimate, socially legitimate and lawful way to make money, well, people oftentimes turn to illegitimate or criminal means to make money. So with poverty comes high crime rates, particularly violent crime. And so these, the the consequences of being born into poverty, it becomes a cycle where the consequences become the causes and the causes become the consequences and so on. It's an incredibly hard cycle to break out of. And we'll kind of conclude today looking at modern day slavery around the globe. So modern day slavery and global inequality tend to go hand in hand. Slavery, as you might be aware, refers to any time people are sold, treated as property, or forced to work for little or no pay. 47 countries today have still not recognized human trafficking as a crime. Nearly 100 countries still fail to criminalize forced labor. And if they do, the penalty is pretty piddly. Maybe there's a small fine imposed. And less than 1/3 of countries protect women and girls from forced or servile marriage. Now, obviously, these estimates up here, current estimates say there's about, 10 to 30 million slaves across the world today. That about 600 to 800,000 people are trafficked across borders every year. Of course, these are, the international slave markets are not, on any public records anywhere, right? It's a very shadowy underworld. And so these are just estimates. They're probably underestimates. So keep that in mind. So we're going to look at some different types of slavery that still exist today. Number one is chattel slavery. This is the kind of slavery that we had in our United States of America up until the Emancipation Proclamation. That chattel slavery is when one person owns another person as their property. So certainly what we saw in the South pre-Civil War. However, chattel slavery still exists today, particularly in the illegal market for domestic workers. I have a video posted on Blackboard called Silicon Valley's Online Slave Market, which I highly recommend you to watch if you want to learn a little bit more about that. Another very common form of slavery that occurs today is called debt bondage. And this is when poor people will pledge themselves as servants in exchange for the cost of basic necessities like transportation, room, and board. So for example, what might happen is, let's say there's a woman in the Philippines. She doesn't have, she's looking for a better life. And somebody comes in, a scout, and offers her a job in France. And they say, your airplane ticket is paid for, you're going to have a place to live, you might have to pay rent, but that's okay. We'll pay you once you get there. But once she arrives in France, she's told her plane ticket was $1,000, and that has to be paid back. And she has to pay $300 a month in rent. But when she gets there, she finds out her wage is only $50 a week. Well, how on earth is she ever going to repay, that initial debt of $1,300 plus all the other expenses that they're going to tack onto it, which then leaves her in a cycle of debt, which she'll never really be able to repay. So she kind of gets stuck in this debt bondage situation. So a lot of times, these employers will actually lock their employees into their rooms at night. They won't allow them to have cell phones or any communication with the outside world to kind of prevent them from escaping. They'll confiscate their travel visas, so they're essentially unable to leave that country that they've been brought to. Human trafficking is another form of slavery. And then debt bondage could be, kind of one example of human trafficking. But this form occurs when people are moved away from their communities and forced to work against their will. It refers to recruitment, transportation, transfer, harboring, and the receipt of people. People are often threatened, forced, abducted, or deceived into trade. And human trafficking can result in forced labor, bonded labor, child labor, and sexual slavery. I mentioned servile marriage a couple times, but this is when a person, usually a young girl, is promised or offered for marriage without their consent. 1 in 9 girls in low-income nations are forced into a servile marriage. And young girls and women often have their rights to health, education, and freedom from physical, psychological, and sexual violence violated. I have a couple links for you to explore if you want to. This one here is from the BBC. It looks at, kind of different forms of modern slavery today and different products or goods that we might consume that come to us from slavery, which we might not even think about oftentimes. Then there's another link here for those of us in Georgia listening. Modern day slavery doesn't just happen in countries far away. There was actually a huge human trafficking bust that happened in Georgia in late 2021 in December. So I have a link here to the article about that bust that happened out there. And lastly, just focus in on, what, if anything, can we, as individuals in a high-income nation do about, international slavery? Well, most slaves, are living, slavery, modern-day slavery is most prevalent in all the kind of orange and red nations that you're seeing on this global map, right? However, a lot of the goods that are produced by this slavery comes to the United States and other wealthier nations. So these are the top 5 goods that are produced by slavery. It's estimated that the global slave kind of market brings in about $354 billion every year. And you can kind of see, it's a little blurry, but this graph toward the bottom is showing you which countries consume the most goods produced by slavery. And yes, that's the United States with the super high bar graph right there. We consume about $144 billion worth of goods produced by slavery every year. And we're followed by, Japan, Germany, the UK, France, Canada, South Korea, Australia, Mexico, India, and so on. So what are the goods, right, that are predominantly coming to us that are produced by slavery? Number 1, this would be the purple section of the graph right here, come to us from laptops, computers, and mobile phones. Number 2 most prominent good that we buy that comes from slavery are garments, so our clothing, and that's the kind of peach segment of the bar graph here. Number 3, so that's the vast majority right there, laptops, cell phones, computers, and our garments. But then number 3, fishing industry globally has a lot of slavery going on in it. Cocoa, chocolate, if you enjoy a Reese's or a Hershey's bar, and sugar cane. So those are the top 5 products that we tend to buy in high-income nations, particularly in the U.S., that are supporting, in a way, this global slave market and human trafficking. So if there is anything we can do, we can pay attention to what we're buying, especially when it comes to these 5 key product markets. And that leaves us with a quote from Nelson Mandela for you. Poverty is not an accident like slavery and apartheid. It is man-made and can be removed by the actions of human beings. So I'll leave you with that. I hope you have a wonderful week. Think about the clothes in your closet and the labels on those and where they were made. And also, as bad off as things might seem sometimes in our high-income nations, we do have a lot to be thankful for. All right. Have a great week. I hope to see you all back next week. And thank you. Goodbye.